welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, today marks the 25th anniversary of the tensions between China and South Korea. The event has been muted due to recent tensions, though, over THAAD. So how can neighborly ties improve? The Chinese documentary 22 recalls the experiences of so-called comfort women during Japan's occupation of China in the Second World War. Will the screening bring more global awareness to these victims? This year marks the 25th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and South Korea. Since the year 1992, trade volume has increased and the two countries have enjoyed much contact through tourism and cultural exchanges. But after Seoul decided to deploy THAAD, bilateral ties dropped to a freezing point, some say, leaving many people wondering whether ties could ever get back on track again.
A quarter-century of friendship. Thursday marks the 25th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and South Korea. In a congratulatory message to South Korean President Moon Jae-in, China's President Xi Jinping pledged to make concerted efforts with Moon to address differences between the two countries properly.
According to the convention, President Xi and President Moon have exchanged congratulatory messages on the 25th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations. Positive outcomes achieved during the past 25 years has delivered tangible benefits to the two countries and two peoples. We hope the ROK earnestly cherishes the lessons since the establishment of China-ROK diplomatic ties to cement mutual trust, properly handle disputes with constructive methods, and build towards a brighter shared future. As for the THAAD issues, China's stance remains firm. China has always been firmly opposed to the deployment of THAAD.
China-South Korea bilateral ties are challenged by recent tensions on the peninsula. Two intercontinental ballistic missile tests in July by the DPRK resulted in a new round of tougher global sanctions. Chinese companies are among those listed. Also, the deployment of THAAD anti-missile systems brings the relations to a new low. Early this week, South Korea and the U.S. started their annual drills. The U.S. sent less troops this year, some say because the DPRK held their fire after threatening to bomb Guam.
I'm pleased to see that the regime in Pyongyang has certainly demonstrated some level of restraint that we've not seen in the past. We hope that this is the beginning of this signal that we've been looking for, that they are ready to restrain their level of tensions, they're ready to restrain their provocative acts, and that perhaps we are seeing our pathway to sometime in the near future having some dialogue. We need to see more on their part.
China-South Korea relations are strongly affected by moves from the U.S. and the DPRK. Given the uncertainties on the peninsula, improving the bilateral ties would need more caution and patience.
So what is the reality on the 25th anniversary of China-South Korea diplomatic relations? Joining us in Beijing, we have Professor WWII, who is the director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University here in Beijing. Welcome, Professor. Also joining us in Seoul, South Korea, we invited Jinjiang Lim, who is an assistant professor at the College of International Relations at Ritsumeikan University. I wanted to begin our conversation with Ms. Lim. 25 years, trade volume has been jumping upward like never before, and yet diplomatic relations seem to be at a low point.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I also searched out some statistic, and according to the current statistic, it looks like our trade volume between the China and the South Korea has jumped up to by like 30, more than 30 times actually compared to the 25 years ago. And not only just this kind of commercial activity, interactions between the two countries, socially, human networks has been widened and that deepened too. So in that sense, I remain pretty much optimistic, because as long as these human networks are working underneath the surface, ultimately I hope and I'm pretty sure our diplomatic relations can evolve further.
But Professor Wang, THAAD has always been quite a key word these days in the bilateral relations. it seems that neither of the two wants to get on its original stance. One is against, and the other is determined to deploy.
Well, it's not just about Assad. Actually, the China-ROK relations, I think the third factor is very crucial, North Korea and the United States. Every time when they have the tensions between North Korea and the United States, and then China-ROK relations definitely will be damaged. So Assad is just one of the results. That means,
symptom.
Yes, it's a symptom, definitely. Because now the problem is the South Korean said we need Assad to defend ourselves. But China says the Assad is for the U.S., it's for global missile defense systems use. It's just make the excuse of the North Korea threat. For the technologically, South Korea cannot control the Assad missile defense system.
When is it going to be picked up again? As long as Assad is there, as long as there are concerns, as long as China and ROK's relationship is always likely to be influenced dramatically by a third party, how can the two countries be able to find a stable development path for its neighborly relations?
I totally understand how the Chinese or counterparts feel about the Assad deployment, as Professor Wang highlighted. We are actually sympathetic. Overall, we are sympathetic with the Chinese concerns. But at the same time, I really hope our Chinese counterparts should remember, I hope, again, remember the fundamental point. Fundamental point of all this controversies is who actually started all this, escalation. Again, the North Korea, they already, tested twice, actually, for the longer range missile. So as long as they keep doing or keep escalating all this, provocations, South Korean publics also increasingly feel this is a real threat. So according to these days, current public poll data, these days, more than actually 70% of the respondents, they said like a Assad deployment is like necessary for our defense. So my point is, as long as people feel increasingly threatened by, again, the North Korea's that kind of, provocations, it is also we are not actually welcoming all this, escalation of provocations. But again, as long as our people feel like that way, I think our government has only like limited options.
But the question is, will the bilateral relations be for a long term influenced and impacted negatively by the THAAD system, or at least the debate about the system between the two countries? Professor Wang.
Well, so long as the Assad missile defense system is still there, and it's a challenge to China's national security, China-ROK relations will be live in the shadow of the Assad missile defense system. Beyond that, I think the China-ROK economic relations also now feel more competitions than before. For instance, that the ROK investment in the Chinese market compared to the previous time is not so. It's not easy to make profits in Chinese market because they feel more competition from the Chinese domestic industries, but also external and overseas market. China and ROK also compete each other, so this can work together, make our relations suffer in the recent years.
Can trade and economic ties still be the so-called foundation of the two-country relations? Is it still viable as China's economic landscape has also been changing? Ms. Lim?
Oh, okay, yes. Yeah, you're totally right. I can agree more with Professor Wang's critical point. Again, we used to, have been enjoying, the South Korea has been enjoying the trade surplus from the trade with China. But you're totally right, as long as the Chinese industries, businesses are getting more and more competitiveness in the global market, we inevitably probably will compete more. From that perspective, our relationship can be also like a shaky because of this kind of, you know, trade friction. But at the same time, I really want to highlight all those human networks. I mean, if you think about, for example, students, number of students who study here, I mean, in South Korea from China, or vice versa. We do have actually more students, I mean, who study in the China from, again, Korea. So if you think about all this, you know, very deepened human networks, again, I want to remain, again, optimistic as much as I can.
It seems that both of you have been illustrating not only about the economic and trade part, but also about geopolitical part. And some could really question the fact that when both of you have clearly said the key to the bilateral relations sometimes are not necessarily in the hands of these two countries. It could be in the third parties, and it could be easily manipulated by a third party. What would be the ways and the strategies the two neighborly countries have to work out, and a vision that has to be worked out, so that there will be peace in this part of the world and the two countries can go on to cooperate on some of the most important causes of this region, for example, on the Korean Peninsula, the nuclear issue?
If in the long term, like 60-party talks were resumed, and North Korea will build the diplomatic relations with the United States, or any common security mechanism will replace of the so-called the ceasefire treaty, and then Korean Peninsula and Northeastern Asia will be stabilized.
Well, I
That's
see
the
Professor
long-term
Wang
future.
likes to talk about the long-term six-party talks. At this point, it's not very likely to be conducted in the very near future. At this point, Ms. Lim, what is the starting point? You have a new president, Moon Jae-in. He talked about some very different policies compared to the previous administration. But are there some crossroads for China and South Korea at this point to pick it up and as quickly as possible? Ms. Lim.
Yes, again, I can't agree more. I think the bilateral relations between the China and the South Korea, there is almost, I think, no problem. But as you, both of you highlighted several times already, again, the third party factor is sometimes damaging this, you know, very sound relations, sound bilateral relations between the two. Again, the fundamental problem is North Korea's nuclear missile threat. So we really, I think, have to try to solve this problem together, and for that, I think we all. I mean, our presidents already have a summit at the G20, but another like a bilateral summit between our two presidents, again, President Xi Jinping and the President Moon. I think it should be done as early as possible.
Is there some starting point? Is there some starting point when we talk about presidents meet? Yet they meet, but they have to meet in order to have some kinds of consensus. Where could these consensus be for South Korea and China now in this deadlock? Because right now we are all talking about let's just have the double freeze, you know, for the U.S. and South Korea to freeze the military exercise, and it is not, and for the DPRK to freeze its nuclear system, and it is not. So where is the starting point?
I think we already have enough reasons, I mean, to meet each other. I mean, at least between our two presidents. Yes. So who gonna take the initiative? Hopefully, almost simultaneously, if the two presidents can suggest almost simultaneously, it would be wonderful. I don't have a clear, I mean, specific answer for that question, but again, I think there are many reasons already, you know, almost enough reasons already for the bilateral summit between the two presidents.
The summit could be conducted, but the question is really about what? Professor Wang, what is your ideas? You know, where is the starting point for China and South Korea? Now we see the military exercises going on between South Korea and the United States. Now we see North Korea and the United States still do not want to see eye to eye about any possibility direct talks in different ways even. Now we see China has been trying to persuade one party, please forget about the joint military exercise, and the other party, please stop the nuclear test so that there will be not more further escalation of tensions. But nobody's listening to China, Professor Wang. So that's reality. So from China's perspective, is there a way to work with South Korea at all on this?
Definitely, we should work together because
should is one thing, can is another thing.
You know, North Korea issues, I think, challenges not only South Korea's security environment, but also China, definitely. But we also should consider about not just use of the North Korea threat, but in the North Korea's eyes, the U.S. ROK Islands joint military exercises again and again also is a threat to China, to North Korea. So we should work together to consider about each other. And then there's a hope that in the fall, the President Trump is visiting China. So to be frankly, the China-ROK relations also we should trace back to the big picture like China-U.S. relations. And the United States want to make the many tensions in Northeast Asia to even work together with the trade war with China to want to make a deal with China. That they need a ground bargain in the future.
Ms. Lim, do you agree with those accusations said by Professor Wang against the United States?
Yes, absolutely. Again, I mean, these two countries' bilateral relations has been developing, evolving for the past 25 years, and definitely I do think this relationship will be developing further. We do have lots of this, potential, how would you say, threats, but again, as long as we, both of us, again, think this is the fundamental problem and this is the urgent issue, I think we can work together. Again, from our point of view, the worst scenario will be like a bilateral dialogue between the Pyongyang and Washington, excluding actually South Korea or excluding China, because we are the stakeholder of all this regional dynamics. So I think, again, we really have to work closely together.
But another thing is probably a talk between the North and the South. Is there a possibility about that?
Well, many people thought that this new administration, Moon Jae-in administration, can have a very different, how would you say, approach toward North Korea. But again, as I briefly just mentioned previously, again, the public opinions about the North Korea has been becoming increasingly actually bad, which means, I mean, most of us actually can't agree that easily with our bilateral talks, two Koreas, that kind of inter-Korea summit or dialogue. And more important thing is the Pyongyang's actually intention is not about that. So as long as they don't actually prioritize all this kind of dialogues with us, I think there can be very small, low possibilities for the kind of bilateral inter-Korean dialogues in the near future.
Their priority is one thing. What about the priority of Seoul? I mean, on the one hand, you have this long-time ally called the United States, and it is playing certain roles in the region. You need that. But on the other hand, there is this neighbor which you are increasingly interacting with, as you said, people to people, business and economic, and now more even geopolitical on the Korean Peninsula issue. So what about this choice and balance that South Korea aspires to make? Do you think this administration is going to do it well? What actually should be some of the basic principles of this balance?
Absolutely, our priority is peace, non-violence, no war anymore. I mean, in the Korean Peninsula, we experienced that kind of bloody, massive violence 70 decades ago. So we don't want to repeat again. It was a disaster, fiasco to everybody, and we don't want to, and we should not repeat that kind of, massive violence in this prosperous region. So that's absolutely our priority. Of course, the how to deal with that, all this complicating issue, is a huge challenge for this new administration. Of course, they have to, I think, communicate more with our counterparts again in Beijing and in Washington and in Tokyo too. Again, this new administration doesn't show a kind of clear, probably pictures yet, but I think they're gonna try to. They're gonna keep having conversations with our key major counterparts.
And Professor Wang, how does China see that delicate balance that South Korea likely needs to take? And how will China, accept that? How well will China accept that?
Korean Peninsula only can be stable when North Korea feels they have the safe environment. Now they're seeking the second strike, the United States, nuclear, but maybe in other ways, the South Korea and the United States and China work together can provide some security guarantee to North Korea, and then this tension will be come down.
Wang Yiwei, Jin Zhanglim, certainly this is going to be a very low-key 25th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between China and South Korea, but we hope it could be some upswing from now on. We don't have enough reasons for that, but we hope there will be enough in the very near future. Thank you so much for being with us. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei on CGTN. Still to come on our program, the Chinese documentary 22 recalls the experiences of so-called comfort women, women sex slaves during Japan's occupation of China in World War II. Will the screening of this film help the aging victims find compensation and, most importantly, justice? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. A documentary on the Chinese victims of Japanese wartime sex slavery has hit the Chinese cinemas around this country this month. It is the first time this kind of film has been approved for the big screen. 22 follows the 22 surviving comfort women, so-called, as they go about their daily lives, offering their personal perspective on life and on the world. This film has already set a box office record for documentaries ever in China. For more on the movie 22 and Chinese comfort women, we have in Beijing Mr. Jia Xiudong, Senior International Affairs Commentator with us. He is coming from the China Institute of International Studies. And also joining us in Seoul, South Korea, we have Professor Oh In-yu, Professor of History from Korea University. Welcome to both of you. Professor Oh, this is a Chinese documentary, and yet we know these kind of documentaries been made in China, in South Korea, even in Japan, and elsewhere in Asia. What do you make of the strong messages coming from these movies?
Well, first of all, I share my sincere gratitude to the Chinese people who finally got to the point of acknowledging the ongoing saga of all these women we call shamefully comfort women. Now we are on the same historical understanding line where two peoples in East Asia can freely talk about this problem and share our anguish and emotion about these women and try to find future solutions together for the betterment of our future. So I sincerely welcome of these new documentaries, and I know that this is second of the series. So I really appreciate all the efforts shown by the Chinese people, especially the director of the documentary film, trying to produce several important, significant contributions to human history.
Well, Mr. Jia, as you may know, here in China, this is not the first one, not even the second one, documentaries, not to mention novels and books and other means of letting the public know of what happened with the comfort women. But this is one of those very made public as a result of the support provided by the movie theaters and I guess the movie distribution channels. What do you make of the success of this documentary in the ticket box?
Most of them are young people of China. So they go to the theater to see the documentary, not kind of Hollywood style action film, but
what does it say?
It says a lot about the thinking of the Chinese young people.
Watching the real person recounting the horrific stories happen to them in their lives earlier. It's totally a very different experience. I remember one of those elderly citizens said in the movie, and here I quote, "The world is so good. Sustain your life to be witness to it, even if that means eating only wild vegetables." That's one of those surviving comfort women who said that to the documentary filmmakers when she was being filmed. She was just not necessarily telling every details she had, but rather celebrate her life. I guess that's a lot of strength in it. Professor Oh, for Korean women, there were a lot of those similar stories as well, I would assume.
Yeah, there are many similar stories in Korea as well. We have more women speaking out loud to the world about their anguish problems and stigmatization in their own societies as well, especially calling for apologies, sincere apologies from the Japanese government. They do not ask for any material benefit, reparation from the government or Japanese people, but they want sincere apologies because the words they cannot express is the emotion they have to hide from the beginning, the point when they were victimized. And the word of sincere apology is what they really ask for. And these women had gone through a terrible life, not only in Japan, China, or elsewhere, but also in Korea as well.
But Professor Oh, as you may know, there were earlier an agreement between the Park Geun-hye administration and the Abe administration in Japan, talking about seal a deal to deal with so-called comfort women issue in South Korea. What this deal is about? It's about, quote, an apology from Prime Minister Abe plus $8 million so-called to compensate the sufferings. But I guess, Professor Oh, since then there were a lot of opposition voices coming from the Korean public against this specific agreement, saying this is not the way to heal the wounds. Professor Oh, what would you say?
Well, this is the repetition of the same mistake that the Korean government has been committing since the beginning of the problem. That is, when in 1962, Park Geun-hye's father, President Park Chung-hee, also signed a deal in 1965, with the Japanese during their treaty efforts. And at that time, they never even discussed this issue with the comfort women victims, but they signed a deal saying all the reparation has been paid for by the Japanese government. But this is the second time that the Japanese government and the Korean government signing the same kind of treaty without talking to the victims themselves, saying that we'll pay one more time, please seal it forever. Now, as I told earlier, money is not the issue here, and it's not a lot of money. I mean, even a scant amount of money, it doesn't really need for these people. And what they're really asking for is a sincere apology, and they want participation in the decision-making process. If anybody want to sign a treaty between the two governments, they must be heard for the first time before any signing takes place.
Mr. Jia, now in China there were also civil lawsuits against the Japanese invaders then who were committing crimes to these comfort women. The reason we call them comfort women, it was used by the Japanese during the Second World War, but actually the nature of these women are sex slaves. They were put and forced into sex slavery during the Second World War. Mr. Jia, do we see much result of those lawsuits?
Actually, the Japanese court denied the request of the victims, and they acknowledged some of the facts of the case, but they refused the lawsuit because they said, well, the individuals have no right to sue the Japanese government. So that's kind of a huge disappointment for their victims. So actually that's in line with the Japanese current policy of not acknowledging any responsibility of Japan, that state, in the wartime atrocities. So, with this, the comfort women were victims of wartime crimes and wartime atrocities. Now they have become victims of some kind of historical distortion in Japan, giving a very strong right-wing movements in Japan, movements denying the history. That's what we see in Japanese textbooks, school books, which in the past they acknowledge some of the facts of historical fact, but now they're trying to delete those facts from the textbooks and history books.
I remember very clearly in that specific documentary we talk about, 22, there was one Japanese girl who was studying and working in China. She would go to try to comfort one of those left behind still comfort women living in a small mountain, very isolated. She tried to brought her some food and also by talking to her, interacting with her. But that is the effort of an individual. And that Japanese girl has not committed any crime. And yet we are seeing a government and an administration totally denying the history, despite of the fact there are many like those Japanese girls that I talk about who recognize what history has taught us and who want to help in the process. There's such a divide we are seeing from the administration and the public consensus over there in Japan. Having said so, Professor Oh, let me ask you about this. There's a dilemma. Many of the comfort women or the sex slaves that were forced into this during the Second World War by the Japanese are dying. They are in their 90s. Some are already reaching 100 years old. So the fewer likely of them going to speak out for the future process, whether to the public or bring a lawsuit against the Japanese government or then the Japanese government. So what can we do, Professor Oh?
Well, we need to also work hard together internationally to find a common historical understanding of this problem. The war crimes against women is a very universal, historically universal problem throughout. So we have to find some kind of international effort, organization to stop war crimes of all kinds against women to begin with. I think that's a very important first step that human beings can take to prevent any future atrocities against women during the war. As we speak of it, in Syria and other places, there are a lot of women who are mass raped and killed by soldiers of all kinds. So we need an international organization to stop war crimes against women. That's the first thing we have to work hard, and China should be a leader. Korea should help with China. We have to work together toward that goal. And number two, we have to have an international commission of some kind to establish a historical forum about war crimes against women of all kinds, including sex slaves from China, Korea, the Philippines, and Vietnam, and whatnot. So if these two efforts are internationally worked out together, cooperated between countries, that's a great progress in terms of historical preservation of this problem and future solution of this problem. Locally, I think China and Korea and Japan probably, if they agree, can work out some kind of deal, common deal in Asia, preventing a regional commission to stop war crimes against all kinds of women, I think.
It is very important, but at the same time, Mr. Jia, you may remember in the movie the names of those who were filmed in the documentary. At the end of it, there was a list. And actually, most of them were being crossed out because they've just passed away. Out of the 22, only 8 left on that board. It's such a tragedy that they would not even see justice being done at the end of their life, even though they have once again unhealed their wounds in order to tell the world what exactly happened during the Second World War. Now, Mr. Jia, besides the International Commission, the regional framework that Professor Oh had been talking about, there's another thing. That is, these women have been isolated by their own people as well. out of so-called traditional belief of purity of women and out of people's lack of understanding of what happened, the atrocities to their lives. So I guess there's something not just the Japanese need to realize, but also the local people, whether in China, South Korea, Vietnam, or the Philippines, they need to do for women who have been harmed and hurt. Mr. Jia.
Actually, much has changed in the past in the past 1 or 2 decades when it comes to the issue of the sex slavery, and more people in China now get to know the history, the facts about that. So they have already showed their sympathy, and what is more important is that people would like to record history and make sure that the history will not repeat. But for the survivors of the sex slavery, and they are waiting for justice to be hand out to those who committed the crimes. And this is a dying group, of course, and the numbers of survivors are dwindling. And also, but on the other hand, the Japanese government and those right-wing forces actually are waiting for their deaths. They believe that, well, that period of history may go away with the death of those sex slaves. So it is the responsibility of the current generation in China, also in other countries, including the Republic of Korea and other countries in Asia, to make sure that they will continue to record history. Actually, so far, recently, we're still discovering more evidence on that crimes, including footage, video clips about that part of history. Now, actually, there are many organizations, non-government organizations, that are working to try to ask the UNESCO to include the historical records into its Memory of the World Register. That is one step that people in China and other countries can work together to ensure that people in the future can have access to those historical records. It is accessible, readily accessible to future generations.
I see. Professor Oh, as a historian, you must be very familiar with many of the literatures and records related to the Second World War. The Comfort Women documentary made by China, made by South Korea, for example, The Apology, another one that has won the Busan International Film Festival Award, are very well known these days. But there are other literatures as well. For example, The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang, that's a Chinese-American journalist. We see them once and again, and yet, how come the real record of the history are still not commonly recognized? As a historian, why is it? Help us to understand, to look back at history, to remember, and therefore eventually reconcile.
Well, the problem is, as you said earlier, it's about the tales of women who became victimized and stigmatized by the enemies in their own society. So all the men who were involved in the crime were committed to destroying historical documents, whatever there was any left. Luckily, we have some surviving documentations dug up by one Japanese historian and some other Japanese scholars from the Japanese government side. But also in Korea, we dug up several other pieces from different countries, as well as the Chinese government who found important precious documents. All these documents add up to one fact, historical fact, that the Japanese government was involved in the kidnapping and recruiting of these girls. But again, historians in the so-called former imperialist societies still argue that history must be written objectively, based on concrete evidence. They do not recognize tales testimonies by these women. So it is time that we have to rewrite history based on new philosophy of history, that is that we have to take care of or at least count victims' tales into account in our real history book, so that in the future people can listen to victims' voices as well as victors' voices at the same time. And it is again based on our educational principle. As you said earlier, even in Korea we are split, divided into two groups of people, historians especially, saying one group saying that we need exactly concrete evidence to say anything about the sex slavery. On the other hand, there are historians who argue that victims' voices count in our historical restoration of the facts. So I think we, in Asia at least, we need to be open-minded and be more objective in the sense that we have to take victims' voice into account as well.
Well, we really appreciate both of you for giving your analysis and also your insights about this very troubling period of history. Thank you so much, Oh Ying-yu and Jia Xiudong. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight with Tianwei CGTN in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tianwei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.